Arizona is packed with stories that reach far deeper than its deserts and canyons. Hidden ruins, unexplained symbols, vanished cultures, and strange legends linger across the state. From remote cliff dwellings to mysterious petroglyph sites, these ancient mysteries leave behind clues, but never full answers, turning the landscape into one giant puzzle waiting to be explored. The Hohokam Canal system and its sudden collapse. You can still feel the heat rising off the desert floor long before you see what is left of the old Hohokam world. It's the kind of heat that slows your breathing and makes the air shimmer. And for a moment, it helps you imagine how tough life must have been for the people who lived here more than 1,000 years ago. Yet somehow in this dry, unforgiving valley, the Hohokam built one of the most impressive canal systems in ancient North America. When you walk the edges of these old channels today, they look quiet and harmless. But the story behind them is as heavy as the desert sun. It's a story about ambition, knowledge, survival, and the strange and sudden collapse of a civilization that once thrived here. If you stand near a preserved canal bank, you can picture the movement that once filled this place. Picture men and women shaping the earth with stone tools, carving long channels through the valley floor. Picture families carrying baskets of soil, making walls strong enough to guide water for miles. At the height of their world, the Hohok managed to move river water across almost 400 meters of desert terrain. For a moment, that number doesn't feel real. 400 meters. It is the kind of engineering that makes you stop and rethink everything you thought you knew about ancient people here. Their canals turned a brutal landscape into farmland. Corn, beans, squash, cotton, fields of it stretching across the basin where modern Phoenix stands today. Imagine looking out and seeing a desert changed into a living patchwork of green. The Hohokam didn't just survive in the Sonoran Desert, they reshaped it. They built villages, ball courts, and networks of trade. They created a life that seemed steady, almost permanent. And then after centuries of success, something broke. Trying to understand what happened means walking through the ruins with an open mind. You feel the silence first. It's not the peaceful kind. It's the kind that carries 1,000 questions with no answers. When you look down into a dried canal that once moved water with steady force, you can't help but wonder what the final years of the Hohokam looked like. Did the water flow slower? Did fields start to fail? Did families leave all at once or slowly drift away? There are theories, of course, many theories. Some say the rivers changed course after heavy floods tore through the valley, leaving the canals damaged beyond repair. Others think long droughts weakened the entire system until it simply couldn't support the population anymore. There are ideas about conflicts, sickness, social pressure, or a combination of all these things happening at once. When you're standing there feeling the grit of the desert wind on your face, every theory feels possible. What makes the mystery even stronger is how quickly their world seems to vanish from the record. Villages that once held hundreds of people show signs of sudden abandonment. Canals that once carried life suddenly go dry. It's like a well-built machine that one day just stops. You can spend hours walking the edges of these canals trying to picture the last days. Maybe the walls wore down faster than the people could repair them. Maybe water disputes broke trust between communities. Maybe people simply reached a point where the effort to keep everything running no longer matched the return. There's something haunting about that idea. Not tragic, just human. Every civilization reaches a moment when it has to decide whether to fight, change, or move with it. When you stand near the biggest canal lines, you see how much work it took to keep them functioning. It wasn't a simple system. These channels needed constant care. Walls had to be cleared. Water had to be managed. Floods and droughts had to be handled with fast decisions. Even with modern tools, keeping something this large working would be tough. With stone and wood tools, it must have felt like a never-ending bed. Still, it's hard to ignore the skill behind it all. The Hohokam didn't just dig deep trenches. They understood the land's slope, the way water slowed or sped up, and how to guide it without losing control. If the water moved too fast, the canal walls could break. If it moved too slow, the channel could fill with silt. Every stretch required calculation, observation, and teamwork. You can almost imagine the engineers of their time walking the canals, checking the flow, listening to the sound of the water, making sure everything stayed balanced. That's what makes the collapse feel so puzzling. How could people this skilled let things fall apart? Maybe they didn't let anything happen. Maybe they fought until the very end. You can picture those final efforts. Families trying to fix damaged channels, leaders arguing about what to do next. workers trying to save crops that wouldn't grow. The desert can wear even the strongest community down, especially when the weather shifts in ways no one expects. Another layer to the mystery is the social side. Some archaeologists think the pressure of managing such a huge irrigation system may have created stress inside the community. When a system this large starts to fail, leadership becomes hard. People might start blaming each other. Small problems turn into big ones, just budgets grow. When you look at the long canal lines fading into the distance, it's easy to see how managing them could feel overwhelming. But the collapse isn't the whole story. What remains today carries a quiet power. Walking along these canals gives you a strange mix of respect and sadness. You feel respect for the engineering mind behind it all and sadness for how little we truly understand about their final years. The desert still holds their work, even if only in fragments. Some canal paths line up perfectly with the streets and neighborhoods of modern Phoenix. In a strange way, the city still follows the blueprint, the Hohokam laid down long before skyscrapers and highways appeared. If you visit the spots now, the air feels still, but the land holds memory. You can run your hand along the old canal bank and feel how carefully it was packed. You can crouch at the bottom of a dry channel and stare up at the sky, imagining what it looked like when water once shimmered through it. Sometimes the wind rushes through with enough force to make you think someone is walking behind you. It's easy to forget how many lives passed through here over the centuries. There's a quiet moment that always hits visitors. The moment when you realize how much work it took to keep everything alive. You start thinking about your own routines, your own struggles, and how strange it must have felt for the Hohokam to leave behind a world they built with their hands. Whether they scattered into nearby regions or blended into other communities, their legacy remains in the ground itself. And even without written records, the canals speak for them. Today, if you walk some of the marked trails, you might hear distant traffic, but the deeper you go, the more the desert takes over. Preso bushes shake softly in the wind. The smell of dust mixes with the warm air. In late afternoon, the sun drops low and paints everything a deep gold. It's easy to stand there and think about how different this place used to look. Instead of empty canals, there were flowing channels lined with people carrying water jars guiding their crops toward harvest. Some parts of the modern city still depend on irrigated water that follows the old paths. That small connection feels almost symbolic. Even though the Hohokam collapse remains unsolved, their work still shapes life in the valley. Their story isn't gone. It's just hidden beneath layers of time, sand, and development. When you leave the site, it tends to stay with you. Maybe it is the silence or the sense that something important happened here and slipped away before anyone could understand it. You drive back toward the noise of the city. And it's strange to see the modern world rise up around you. Tall buildings, cars, bright lights, everything feels fast and loud compared to the calm desert floor. But if you look closely, you notice that some roads curve in ways that don't seem modern at all. They trace the old canals following the lines of a vanished civilization. That's the lasting mystery. A culture that mastered the desert, built massive waterworks, and thrived for centuries, only to fade so completely that their final moments still sit just out of reach. The Hohokam left behind channels carved through the land. But the reasons behind their ending remain open to interpretation. Maybe that's why this place draws so many people in. The desert doesn't give away answers easily. It makes you slow down, breathe deeply, and use your imagination. What remains is a reminder of how fragile even the strongest systems can be. And when you walk away from those empty canals, you carry a feeling that sits somewhere between wonder and sadness. You can almost hear the faint rush of water that once moved through this valley, keeping a civilization alive. And even though that sound is long gone, the land still remembers. The White Tank Mountain Petroglyphs. The first thing you notice when you walk into the canyons of the White Tank Mountains is the quiet. It's a thick, warm silence that hangs in the air between the rocks. Almost like the place is waiting for you to notice something. The sun hits the dark stone cliffs and makes them shine in a deep brown tone, and the whole landscape feels older than anything around the Phoenix Valley. Then, as you get closer to the large boulders scattered along the trails, you start to see the marks, simple lines at first, shapes that look like scratches, and then you realize they aren't scratches at all. They're messages carved into the stone by people who lived here long before the modern world even existed. The White Tank Mountain petroglyphs have this effect on a lot of people. You don't just look at them. You stop, you stare, you try to imagine the hands that carved them. These carvings come from the Hohokam, the same desert engineers who built the canal system across the valley. But out here in the stillness of the mountains, you feel something different about them. The carvings don't feel practical or technical, they feel personal, they feel spiritual. They feel like someone wanted to leave a piece of themselves behind. Some of the carvings are easy to make out even from a distance. There are spirals, circles, animals, shapes that look like figures with outstretched arms. Others are harder to understand, almost hidden in the shadows of the rock. You tilt your head and squint, trying to make sense of the older, faded lines. The sun moves, the shadows change, and for a second, the images seem alive. That moment always hits you in a strange way because you start wondering what these symbols meant to the people who made them. Spirals are everywhere. Some think they show water, life, or a journey. Others think they mark a spiritual path or a story about moving between worlds. When you look at them long enough, it's easy to feel like your mind is being pulled inward with the shape, almost like the spiral is guiding you somewhere. Then there are the animal shapes: bighorn, sheep, lizards, birds. They look simple at first, but the lines are careful and controlled. You can feel the intention in every stroke. One of the most striking things in the White Tank Mountains is how the petroglyphs blend with the land. Some are carved high up on canyon walls where you wonder how anyone even reached them. Others sit low at ground level, almost inviting you to kneel beside them. When you place your hand near the rock without touching it, you feel how warm it is from the sun. For a moment, you can picture someone doing the same thing, hundreds of years ago, preparing to carve a story into the stone. The more time you spend out here, the more questions you start to form. Were these carvings part of a tradition? Did they represent ceremonies, warnings, or maps? Or were some of them simple memories, a birth, a hunt, a celebration? There's no written guide, no legend stone that explains everything. You're left to study the shapes and let your imagination fill the gaps. One of the most fascinating things about these petroglyphs is how long they've survived. The rocks here are made of tough volcanic stone, and the desert climate keeps them preserved far better than you'd expect. Wind, sun, and sand have worn them down, but many are still clear and sharp. When the light hits them right, you can almost feel the presence of the artists. It is strange to think that a carving made with a simple stone tool could last longer than whole cities. Walking deeper into the mountains, you start noticing how the carvings seem to appear in clusters at certain points. Some places feel like gathering spots. There might be a giant boulder surrounded by smaller rocks, almost like a natural meeting area. You look up at the cliff walls and find even more petroglyphs watching over the space. You can imagine people sitting here sharing stories, teaching children, or performing rituals. The setting feels right for that kind of moment. There's a natural echo in some of the canyons, and the shade offers relief from the heat. Then there are carvings that sit far from the main paths, tucked away in narrow cracks and small ledges. You only find them if you explore carefully or go with someone who knows the land well. These hidden carvings feel more private, almost secret. They make you think about personal stories, moments someone wanted to capture quietly away from the crowd. But there's another layer to the White Tank mystery that makes the whole experience even more interesting. Some of the symbols don't match the typical patterns of Hohokam art. A few shapes seem older, a few styles seem different. Some people think this means other groups passed through here over thousands of years. The mountains have always been a natural landmark, and water sources in the canyons would have made this a good place to stop. That means these stones may carry stories from more than one culture stacked on top of each other in time. When you stop at one of the viewpoints that overlook the valley, everything feels bigger. You see the modern city stretching out far below, full of movement and noise. And then you turn back toward the mountains where everything stays still. It's hard not to feel a shift inside you. Down there is the fast world. Up here is the old one, and the carvings are like a thin bridge connecting the two. Standing near one of the larger panels, you notice how the desert sounds change as the day moves on. In the morning, you hear birds and the soft scratch of small animals moving in the brush. In the afternoon, the heat grows heavy and the wind turns slow and warm. By evening, you hear nothing but the faint shift of rocks cooling under the dimming sun. The petroglyphs change with the light, too. In the early hours, they're sharp and bright. At midday, they flatten out. At sunset, they start glowing with a soft orange tone that makes them stand out again. That sunset moment is the one that stays with you. If you've ever tried to imagine the ancient desert at night, the White Tank Mountains make that easy. Once the sun drops, the air cools fast, the sky turns clear and deep, stars fill the darkness in a way that almost overwhelms you. You imagine the people who carved these stones looking at the same sky. Maybe some of the symbols even connect to the stars. Circles, lines, grids. Some designs almost look like maps. But again, nothing is certain. You're left with possibilities, and that's part of the magic. Visitors often say they feel watched in the canyons, not in a scary way, but in a quiet, aware kind of way. The petroglyphs sit on the rocks like faces turned toward the trails. Some even look like eyes. It's easy to see why the place feels spiritual. There's a sense that the mountains remember every footstep, every whisper, every moment. When you head back to modern life, the memory of the petroglyphs doesn't fade quickly. You might find yourself thinking about the spiral you saw on a high wall, or the simple figure carved with such confidence you wonder what the carver was thinking. Were they telling a story about their life? Were they marking a sacred spot? Were they leaving a message for the future? Today, the White Tank Mountains are protected and visitors are asked not to touch the carvings. Oils from human skin can damage the patina that keeps them visible. So you stand a little back and take them in with your eyes. That distance almost adds to the mystery. You can't touch the past here. You can only observe it and try to understand it. When you finally step back onto the open trail and look back at the carved rocks, you feel a mix of awe and calm. You carry this quiet respect for people who lived close to the land and left behind signs of their thoughts in a way that survived centuries. The mystery of the White Tank petroglyphs isn't about solving anything. It is about standing in the presence of something ancient and letting it speak in its own silent way. The ancient ruins of Wupatki and their abandonment. The land around Wupatki looks empty at first, almost too wide for the human mind to take in. It stretches out in long waves of red earth and scattered rock with the San Francisco peaks rising in the distance like a blue shadow. The wind comes at you steady, carrying that dry, dusty smell you only get in high desert country. Nothing seems alive at first glance, and that's what makes the sudden sight of the ruins feel so strange. They rise from the ground in sharp angles of red stone. Walls still standing after centuries of sun and storms. When you step closer, it hits you that people once lived here. Not just a few hundreds. Wupatki doesn't feel like an ordinary ruin, it feels like a place that remembers. You walk toward the main structure and the stones shine in the sunlight like warm embers. The walls look almost too neat, too well-shaped, considering the age. They're made from flat slabs of local sandstone with such care that they fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Standing next to them, you can almost picture the hands that lifted each stone. The rhythm of building, the quiet teamwork it must have taken to raise a home out of this lonely landscape. It's strange to think that this place once held a thriving community. Wupatki was filled with families, laughter, meals, stories, and everyday life. Poppy cooked, traded, raised children, planned gatherings, and watched the sky for signs of weather. The land might look harsh now, but at its height, this area made sense as a home. The soil here, though dry, can support crops when the climate cooperates. The people who settled this region, ancestors of the PBLO cultures, knew how to read the land. They timed their planting with the monsoons. They stored water. They traded far beyond the borders of their own villages. And the location itself wasn't chosen by accident. Wupatki sits near volcanic fields where black cinders stretch out in long, dark patches. When the volcano called Sunset Crater erupted around the year 1085, it covered the surrounding land with ash. At first, that must have been terrifying. Raining fire, earth shaking, fields buried. But after the ash settled, it changed the soil's chemistry. It helped trap moisture and created a new layer of fertile ground. For a time, it made farming easier. That's when people began gathering here in larger numbers, building rooms, plazas, ball courts, and even sound-enhancing structures that carry voices farther than you'd expect. Walking through the ruins today, you feel the closeness of the old community in the main building, which once stood at multiple stories. You can trace the outlines of rooms. Some rooms feel tight and warm, maybe used for storage or sleeping. Others open into small plazas where people likely gathered. A few steps away sits a round structure often called the ball court. When you stand in the center of it, the wind echoes differently. You can imagine a crowd gathered around the edge watching a ritual game or some sort of community event. Then there's the blowhole, a natural opening in the earth where air rushes in or out depending on underground pressure. The movement feels almost alive. One moment the air pulls inward, the next it pushes out with surprising force. Visitors often say it feels like the earth is breathing. It's easy to see why ancient people may have considered it sacred. You stand there and feel the cool air hitting your face. And for a moment, it's easy to imagine someone hundreds of years ago doing the same thing, wondering what hidden world lay below. Even though Wupatki looks remote now, at its height, it was part of a larger network of communities. People traveled between settlements, shared resources, and maintained ties with groups across the Southwest. They carried items like shells from the Pacific coast and turquoise from far-off mines. That means Wupatki wasn't just a quiet outpost. It was connected, important, and full of life. And then just a few generations later, it was abandoned. That's the part that makes the mystery feel heavier. As you walk the site, you stand in an empty room and picture it once filled with food, tools, baskets, and voices. Then you remember that everything was left behind. People moved away, not slowly and gradually across centuries, but in a window of time short enough that it leaves you wondering why. One of the strongest theories ties back to the same volcano that helped bring people here. Over time, the ash layer that once trapped moisture may have begun blowing away. Without it, the soil turned dry again and farming became harder. You can imagine families watching their fields fade and thinking about trying their luck somewhere else. Climate patterns may have shifted to long droughts swept through the Southwest around this period. Crops would fail, water sources would shrink, and communities would feel the pressure. Wupatki sits in a region where rainfall can change everything. Too much rain brings erosion, too little brings hunger. The people living here understood these cycles well. But if the land stopped supporting them, the choice to leave may have been practical. There are other ideas as well. Some think the land simply couldn't support the growing population for long. The area around Wupatki was never lush. Even at its best, it required careful planning to make it work. As families grew, they may have pushed the limits of what the soil and water could provide. Eventually, moving on might have been better than staying. But the most mysterious question is how fast it all happened. Walking the site today, you get the sense of a place that was suddenly left behind. It doesn't feel worn down by time alone, it feels paused. Rooms still show the shape of their old use. The plaza still opens the way it did centuries ago. The steps leading up to the higher levels still carry a sense of direction. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the footsteps of a community at work. Some visitors say Wupatki has an emotional presence, almost like the place remembers the people who lived here. You feel it most in the quiet corners where the wind wraps around the stone walls. The structures create natural channels of sound. It's easy to imagine voices traveling across the plaza during a family gathering or an evening meeting. It's also easy to imagine the confusion and concern in the final days. Leaders discussing the future, families packing their belongings, children asking unanswered questions. When you wander deeper into the ruins, you find small rooms that hint at storage, cooking, or making tools. One of the more fascinating things is how the builders used every angle of the environment. Stones were placed to block strong winds. Doorways were shaped to let in the right amount of light. Even the walls were layered in ways that helped with insulation. Nothing about the construction feels rushed. Everything looks thoughtful. That's part of what makes the abandonment feel so strange. These weren't people who built casually. They put care into every room. If they left, they likely had a serious reason. Today, the area around Wupatki is quiet, except for the sound of the wind brushing across the rocks. Sometimes you hear ravens calling from the cliffs. Sometimes the air goes still and the silence becomes almost unreal. You walk from ruin to ruin and the ground crunches lightly under your feet. The red dust sticks to your shoes. The sun presses down hard, but the deeper corners of the structures offer shade that feels almost cool. If you stand on a higher lookout, you can see how far the deserts stretch. It gives you a sense of how isolated the community must have felt even while being part of a trade network. The view is wide and beautiful, but also harsh. It's as easy to imagine the frustration of trying to farm during a drought or watching a field fail after too much wind. When you finally walk away from the ruins, the feeling stays with you. Wupatki isn't just a collection of old walls. It's the memory of a living community preserved in stone and silence. You leave with questions. Why here? Why then? and why so suddenly? Maybe the people simply followed the land signals and moved on, seeking better ground. Maybe they joined other communities and carried their traditions elsewhere. What remains on the desert floor today is a quiet reminder that even strong settlements can fade. And sometimes the reasons slip away long before the structures do. Wupatki stands as a place where the past still feels close, where the wind seems to whisper the stories left behind, and where the mystery of abandonment turns a simple ruin into something unforgettable. The Tonto Basin Salado culture disappearance. The first time you stand in the Tonto Basin, the place feels strangely quiet, almost like it's holding something back. The cliffs rise in long broken walls. The river curls through the middle, and scattered across the ridges are the ruins and traces left by the Salado people. They arrived here centuries ago in a landscape that wasn't nearly as empty as it looks today. This basin once carried voices, fires, trade routes, and whole communities built from stone and clay. What makes it so compelling is how suddenly all of that life seems to stop. One of the most resilient cultures in the ancient Southwest simply fades out, leaving behind just enough evidence to show how complex they were, but not enough to explain why they vanished. The Salado weren't a single tribe or single origin group. They were more like a blending of people and traditions. Hohokam influences from the south, Moyan roots from the mountains, and ancestral Ploan ideas filtering in from the north. You see this mix in the pottery styles, in the architecture, in the way they organized their villages on the hillsides overlooking the basin. These weren't isolated farmers, they were connected to a larger world. If you found yourself walking through the basin around the 1300s, you'd see multi-room dwellings, elevated storage areas, and communal spaces that probably acted as gathering points for ceremonies or trade. And then you have the pottery, the famous Salado polychrome, bold reds, crisp whites, deep blacks. The designs feel expressive, almost emotional, like the artists weren't just decorating vessels, but telling stories. These pots traveled far beyond the basin. They show up in excavations across Arizona and New Mexico. A sign that the Salado were part of a thriving network, a culture that produces art that recognizable doesn't just vanish without leaving a puzzle behind. And that's exactly what happened here. Around the late 1300s and early 1400s, something changed. Villages were abandoned. Cliff dwellings were left empty. Pottery production slowed dramatically, and then almost like a quiet final note, the Salado presence in the Tonto Basin disappears. Archaeologists argue over what caused it. Drought is always on the list, and there's good evidence for it. Tree rings from surrounding regions show years of poor rainfall. Crops would have failed. Rivers would have shrunk. Living in the basin would have become harder each season. But drought alone doesn't explain everything. Some villages were located near reliable water sources and still emptied out. Something bigger was happening, something that pushed people to leave even the stronger settlements behind. One theory looks at social pressure. The Salado lived at a crossroads between several cultural regions, and when times grew harder, competition could have flared up. You can imagine how tension builds when food is scarce. When the river drops lower each year, when storms don't come, cooperation breaks down, people move towards safer territories. But even that doesn't fully capture the scale of their departure. Another explanation points to migration. During this period, groups from areas farther north were moving into new regions, probably forced out by their own environmental challenges. When new groups enter a fragile landscape, it can shift the balance quickly. Maybe the Salado chose to blend into other communities. Maybe they joined groups with more reliable water. Maybe they were pushed into moving for their own survival. What makes this disappearance so mysterious is how abruptly it seems to happen. There's no single moment that marks the end. It's more like a slow dimming that accelerates suddenly near the end. Villages that had been active for generations go silent. The pottery styles stop appearing. Trade connections fade, and after that the historical record becomes quiet. If you hike up to the cliff dwellings today, you feel that quiet in a physical way. These structures aren't dramatic in size, but their placement is deliberate. They sit tucked under overhangs or perched against canyon walls, protected from the heat and positioned to watch the basin below. When you stand there, you realize how much life would have passed through these spaces. Children climbing ladders, the smell of corn roasting, the wind curling through the canyon openings. It's hard not to feel that something important happened here, something that left no direct explanation. One of the places that shows this best is the Tonto National Monument. The cliff dwellings, There are some of the most intact Salado structures anywhere in the region. When you walk into the rooms, the ceilings still show soot from ancient fires. The walls still hold the shape of the hands that built them. It's one of those rare spots where the past doesn't feel distant. You can imagine the shift of light through the doorway and the sound of voices echoing off the rock. But even in these well-preserved spaces, the big question hangs in the air: why did they leave? Some archaeologists think the Salado held a kind of buffer zone role between cultures that were anonymous. Being in the middle became dangerous. If outside pressures grew too strong, leaving might have been the only option. Others think internal stress, political or spiritual, played a part. The Salado world wasn't simple. It was layered with traditions drawn from multiple cultures. Holding those together might have become too difficult in the face of environmental collapse. There's also the possibility that the Salado didn't disappear at all. They simply became part of other communities. Some modern tribes trace portions of their heritage back to groups that once lived in the basin. Though these connections often survive through oral stories rather than written records, if the Salado merged into larger or more stable societies, the culture would blend, shift, and eventually lose its distinctiveness. That kind of disappearance is quiet, but it's no less real. Today, when you visit the Tonto Basin, it doesn't feel empty, it feels layered. The air carries that subtle desert smell: dry grass, sun-warmed stone, a hint of mosquito. The landscape stretches out in soft colors. And if you go during the cooler months, that gentle breeze has a calming quality. But beneath that calm, there's a sense of something unfinished. The ruins don't feel abandoned in a tragic way. They feel paused, as if the people stepped out and never came back. Walking the trails, you'll notice the same thing that archaeologists have debated for decades. The basin is beautiful, but it's harsh. Summers can be brutal, and water has always been the deciding factor here. When the river drops low, the land tells you immediately. You can imagine how much harder life would have become for the Salado as the climate shifted. Even today, ranchers and residents keep a close eye on water levels. The challenges haven't changed much in 700 years. My own impression is that the disappearance wasn't a collapse in the dramatic sense. It feels more like a gradual decision made family by family, community by community. The environment tightened, the soil grew tired, outside pressures increased, and the people eventually moved on. Not defeated, just practical. They knew the land better than anyone, and they understood when it was time to seek new horizons. What remains is a mystery shaped not by a single event, but by the slow push of many forces at once. And that's what gives the Tonto Basin its quiet pull. You can stand in the ruins and feel both the presence of the people who lived here and the absence of the answers they left behind. The story is unsolved. And maybe that's why the basin still feels like it's watching, waiting, and holding on to the last chapter of a world that once thrived along its cliffs and rivers.